Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are in our wide world, and welcome to this NetHope strategic conversation. My name is Seth Otto, and I'm the Digital Communications Manager here at NetHope and producer of the NetHope webinar series. We're delighted to be joined today by representatives from the Center for Internet Security, Cisco Talos Intelligence Group, and Catholic Relief Services. And they will be presenting on digitizing management. Oh, whoops, sorry. No, they'll be presenting today on the state of humanitarian and development security in 2023. And let's go over a bit of housekeeping before we get started. First off, let's make sure this webinar is interactive. Let us know what comes up for you. Please post your comments and questions in the chat window. The presenters will address them during the question and answer period. Pay attention to your inbox for a follow-up email that we will send your way in the hours following the webinar. The email will include links to the webinar recording, the slides, and any other resources shared during today's presentation and discussion. And we really appreciate your feedback. Your opinion matters to us, and we use your responses to our survey to improve this webinar series for you and our broader NetHope community. It also provides our presenters with an opportunity to connect with you if you want them to. And with all that out of our way, I'd like to present today's speakers. James Eaton-Lee, NetHope's Chief Information Security Officer. Curtis Dukes is a board member, Executive Vice President, and General Manager, Senior Government Leader at the Center for Internet Security. Joe Marshall is a Senior Strategist, ICS Threat Research at Cisco Talos Intelligence Group, and Joel Urbanowitz is the Senior Director of Digital Workspace Services at Catholic Relief Services. Welcome, everyone. And before we get started, I'm just going to hand it over to our CEO, Lance Pierce, for a special message. Take it away, Lance.
Thank you, Seth, and thanks to all of our distinguished panelists for being here with us today. This issue that we're going to focus on today has just gone from the back office to the center of the risk register for member organizations and for this entire community with breathtaking speed. It's just astonishing when you look at the increases in cyber insurance over the quadruple digit increases. If you look at the exponential increase in the number of attacks that have been taking place on humanitarian organizations and on the member community. If you look at just the range of threat actors and the way that they've increased, it's just exploded in recent years. And so it's become a threat that is in many ways threatening the ability of organizations like those in the NetHope community and elsewhere, threatening their ability to do the work that they've set out to do. And it's in part by looking at the complexity of the way our member missions have to be delivered and all of the various things that need to be safeguarded and protected in the humanitarian sector, not just data, not just systems, but people, but facilities, a whole variety of things that we've really wrapped kind of the umbrella theme for our program in the idea of digital protection as we try to look for collective solutions to this ongoing challenge here with the community. And it's in the spirit of that we've released this report, the 2023 State of Humanitarian and Development Cybersecurity, where we've tried to survey the member community and understand where the community is, what are, in fact, the solutions that may be available, and perhaps most importantly, what are the ways in which we can come together under a collective umbrella of security, under a shared strategy, whereby we can better protect the information, the systems, and the people in our organizations and in our full delivery chain from these threats. And that's really going to be the center of the conversation today. We've got a really distinguished panel of people who we'll be talking with. I'm delighted to say that over the last few months, and in some cases in the last week, we've had an opportunity to meet in person with all of these collaborators in various meetings and trips to the Washington, D.C. area. And we're really delighted to be able to assemble them all here today. Virtual is not so uncommon these days, but getting together in person is increasingly a rarity. So we're really delighted to have gotten some face time with these colleagues and to develop some shared strategies with them on behalf of NetHope and by extension with all of you in the community who are on the front lines of dealing with these challenges. So thanks to all of them for their hard work. I also want to thank the hardworking NetHope team who've been really working on this report as well, really under the leadership of Diana Langley and James Eaton-Lee. This report has come together along with Robin Barrow and the membership team overseeing a lot of the nuts and bolts of gathering the information. It's really thanks to them that we've got this perspective. And now we want to take a moment to dive into this content and talk about what we can do together to mobilize this community, to mobilize all of our resources, and to really develop shared approaches to a threat that is multiplying more rapidly than any individual strategy may go. And therefore, the collective approach is really the way that we in this community have often in the past solved problems. And it's the way I think we'll continue to address this challenge as well. So thanks to all for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, our Chief Information Security Officer for NetHope, James Eaton-Lee. James.
Thanks, Lance. As you said, I'm NetHope's Chief Information Security Officer. As a member-led nonprofit, that makes my role slightly different to CISOs in some other sectors. Essentially, it means I have the privilege of working with NetHope's members, some of the largest nonprofits in the world, as well as the broader ecosystem, to help it respond to some of these challenges, to be digitally resilient, digitally respectful, and digitally responsible. I'm delighted to be joined by these three fantastic people who, in a few minutes, I'm going to invite in turn to share some of their reflections, both on the report and also the broader challenge, state of cybersecurity, in particular for large humanitarian and development organizations. But what I'm going to do for a few minutes is just chat through the scene, set some of the context, talk about where this bit of research came from, and also step through some of the sort of key statistics, key themes that we think emerge from it. We're starting on this slide really to sort of take a step back just for a moment and ask what the point of this problem is. What is the problem domain? Many of you on the call will know that the global humanitarian and international development ecosystem is a really complex web of government and private funding, which is funneled through organizations who range from the gargantuan international organizations like the World Bank or the Red Cross or bits of the UN system, all the way down increasingly to locally led nonprofits and other types of civil society organization. We hope, in fact, that in future the balance shifts much further towards these smaller organizations as the entire apparatus gradually decolonizes as part of the pivot towards localized assistance. Actually, as an aside, as we do that, we'll unlock both new ways of working and scaling, as well as even more cybersecurity challenges, potentially more complex than today's. But today, in the middle of this system, we have a stable of several dozen large international INGOs who represent a critical linchpin in efforts to make our world fairer, freer, safer, and deliver assistance where, for man-made or natural reasons, we fail to do this and have to deal with the consequences, feeding, hydrating, delivering healthcare or sanitation, or safeguarding individuals from harms, before then rebuilding, re-empowering, and resetting. NetHope's 65 members make up about 60% of that work, 60% of non-governmental aid funding more broadly, which is a critical mass of some of these actors. And we know that in 2023, that work is really heavily digitized. Accelerating this is in fact the reason NetHope came into being in the first place. Large INGOs do all sorts of things. They build financial networks, they map out the locations of wells or vulnerable communities, they build chatbots, they install connectivity solutions and hand out mobile phones. And even when they aren't building, supporting, or operating, the digital footprint that they leave is huge. NetHope members and other INGOs in the last 6 months have worked with communities in Syria, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Myanmar, and dozens of other countries in states of conflict or with active humanitarian crises. If we can go to the next slide. We've always known that digital systems will be attacked. But to Lance's point, increasingly we know that those attacks are quite sophisticated, targeted, and often sinister. Sometimes we have this Hollywood image that forms our cultural narrative of what hackers are, but actually we have in practice a pretty good sense of who targets us in the real world, from criminal actors who might want to siphon off public funding, to state and other actors who might be curious about what we do or want to be resident on our systems to see our data. But most chillingly, we know increasingly that some wish to target vulnerable communities, activists, or human rights defenders, and that there are actors, including state actors, who attempt to deliberately leverage the surface area that INGOs present in order to destabilize or misinform vulnerable communities. It's regrettably an established parameter, in fact, of the global social impact project that we're all embarked upon, that this will happen and that it's part of our day-to-day work. If we can go to the next slide. That's the reason that this piece of work came into being. As part of our digital protection program, we try to help members deal with these problems. And this report essentially represents the second time that we have annually assessed our members' ability to meet the challenge. We compile it through a voluntary survey of members, about 35%, so something over half engage with us this year, and we aggregate the data to form the report you see. This year, we've asked questions about program governance, about some key security controls, the perception of risk for senior responsible officers within NGOs, the funding model that they use, cybersecurity frameworks, as well as the frequency and impact of breaches that they may have experienced. It's one of two measurement exercises that we currently do, which aims to build a more cohesive picture of the readiness of the ecosystem to respond. The other being a more detailed biannual assessment against the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls, which digs a few levels deeper. And we should perhaps, in fact, pause and just find it remarkable at all that it is only within the last 2 to 3 years that any transnational actor, to our knowledge, has tried to measure this picture across this ecosystem of players. Next slide. This year, the headlines show some improvement, but we have to be honest, they remain pretty bleak. We've seen improvements across the board in the implementation of some basic safeguards that we know get in the way of most attacks. In 2021, about 1 in 5 NGOs told us that most of their systems were protected by multi-factor authentication, which safeguards against the attempts by attackers to access some back office systems like email or cloud storage. Today, the figure is about 45%. Most INGOs also now have some kind of conversation with their board about cybersecurity. But fully 65% of our members tell us that they don't have confidence in their cybersecurity program. That's a chilling statistic. 2/3 of technologists and NGOs who responded to us don't have confidence in the way they manage this risk area. 85% told us they believe the risk has increased, many calling out specifically conflict zones such as Ukraine. Only 1/3 believe that their cybersecurity budget is adequate, and a significant number of them don't know what it is. And just today, the Nonprofit Times has reported a loss-adjusted 10% reduction in overall philanthropic giving of more than $17 billion in the US domestic market, at a time with more complex crises than ever. And whereas cybersecurity practitioners, we know that even standing still costs money and requires continued investment. If we can go to the next slide. Conversations at the board are a hopeful sign, but we know that in complex multinationals, which is essentially what INGOs are, running a cybersecurity program requires a bunch of things: leadership, technology, and in particular, institutional change. In this year's report, we suggest that only around 1 in 4 large INGOs have a senior cybersecurity leader as a dedicated role, and only about 10% retain a CISO or a director with a reporting line outside the technology team. Next slide. If you follow the broader winds of the digital rights ecosystem, or even the mainstream tech news, you will have seen reporting specifically on tools like NSO Group Pegasus or Intellect's Predator, things that I think we'll touch on in the conversation later on, which we often blandly refer to as spyware. Before diving into all of the gloomy commentary about what these mean for INGOs, I will for a moment suggest that the existence and the analysis of this report is itself hopeful. While the need to undertake this kind of analysis is regrettable, it speaks to the extraordinarily high quality work being carried out across civil society and the tech industry by teams able to undertake sophisticated analysis of what is in effect a marketplace of digital munitions, often used for human rights abuse and to intrude into the private lives of individuals at enormous scale and outside the rule of law. At the beginning of many of our lifetimes, intrusive surveillance required huge teams, bulky equipment, and effort, which was out of the reach of actors other than large governments. But today, we know that dozens of regional actors, of smaller states, and of non-state actors, as well as criminal actors, have access to a marketplace of tools simply designed for abuse, just one of the ways that actors are able to target INGOs in the first place. And the digital footprint of INGOs represents an enormous surface area, all now reachable through automation, with nowhere for any of us to hide behind each other, and presenting uncountable opportunities to target INGOs staff, to divert public funds, and to abuse vulnerable individuals and communities at scale. Few of us want this. The complex web of humanitarian, conservation, and development organizations in the third sector, in the private sector, and in government, however imperfect, is a critical global public good. It's almost unarguable that it should not be able to resist or negate the effects of this automated hostility, or indeed that really it should be necessary in the first place. But we know that it is a reality of the world in which we live. And yet with low rates of confidence in our programming, without the right staff, without the right skills, and without the right budget, the world of an INGO practitioner remains a challenging and often quite a lonely space. I'm going to try and end on a hopeful note. The fact that we're having this conversation at all, and with some of the very smart humans that I'll hand over to in just a second, is itself an eminently hopeful thing. We have some amazing friends, we have some smart donors and partners who realize that this is a problem. We, our peers, And friends across the ecosystem, in government, in institutional funding, in the private sector, are working on the problem from the root cause, the underlying ethics of attacking these actors in the first place, all the way through the supply chain, as well as the tools, techniques, and capabilities needed to respond, as well as the underlying funding necessary to fuel that work. But it's a huge collective problem with many pieces. We only win together by aligning the interests and behaviors of funders, tech partners, and social impact organizations. If you take one thing away from today, please let it be that. We only win by making our response collective. In our internetworked world, a breach of one INGO inevitably affects many more. It inevitably affects many vulnerable people. All of us have different and complementing expertise and knowledge. Dealing with the problem as a commons requires us to unify, align, and apply all of those things. At NetHope, that's why we know the part of the solution is a global humanitarian ISAC, a space for collective communal defense. We'll have a slide, in fact, you've got it on screen at the moment, where you can scan a QR code and find out a bit more. But there are many other perspectives, many pieces of the puzzle, many other prompts for both hope and concern. And on that note, I want to hand over to the first of my guests and invite them to share some of their reflections on the state of things now, as well as on the road ahead. And afterwards, we'll have some time for Q&A. Joe, I'd like to call on you first. Your work takes you from the front lines of conflict all the way through to the engine room of the global tech industry that's working to stave it off. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your take on this problem.
Oh, great. Thank you. Actually, I had slides, but I'm more than happy to just give a spicy idea of what my thoughts are on it, if that's okay.
Please.
Oh, okay. So, and thank you for the introduction. My name is Joe Marshall. I work at Cisco Talos. We're a threat intelligence organization, so it's my job to track what bad people are doing globally, and then stop them. And that means, unfortunately, swimming in the cold ocean of reality of the threat landscape. And really, we're looking at, I think, two fronts right now, especially in the NGO space. Recently, within the last few weeks, and James, actually, I sent you this link to our work on some recent malware that was shared with us from some victims in the Mideast who were infected with a bit of malware on their Android phones that allowed the adversary to completely take control of that phone, intercept phone calls, record phone calls, access images, email, and if they had multi-factor authentication on that device, then they were also able to, because it's a registered device in the MFA system for the victim, you know, they could even issue themselves or just basically use that device as MFA to get inside of the network. It was very sobering. It was Predators, Aliens. James, if you have a link, you can send it out later for anyone in the community that would love to read it. It's a very technical read, but you can just do the executive summary and skip to the conclusion, and you'll kind of get our thoughts. There is a robust marketplace right now for, how should I say, morally flexible individuals and companies that have no problems selling this, frankly, spyware to interested nation states that choose to either actively just snoop on human rights activists or NGOs to outright, you know, more totalitarian regime where they feel like anyone that's a threat to that country's system is therefore an enemy, and we need to know what they're doing. NSO Group and Israel is really notable at. The one that we actually highlight in our blog post is called Intellexa. And it is a very insidious piece of malware. A lot of these are what we call zero-click ODAs, which means that you as the victim don't actually do anything. These are exploits that these companies find and then basically weaponize to get on these mobile devices. A zero-click is the worst, most horriblest kind of thing. In the bug bounty market, if I were to sell that back to, say, Google, I could make millions of dollars just letting them know that I had found this. So this is a tremendously profitable, money-moving business on the part of these third parties that sell these information collection platforms, and then the tools and methods for these NGOs to be targeted to parties that want to target them. It's a fairly robust marketplace. Again, cannot recommend enough that folks go check our blog post out. I'm sure it'll be provided in the notes afterwards. On the more financial commodity-based crime, so think ransomware, information stealers, crypto miners, we're actually seeing a bit of a pivot. So we've seen a dip in the financially based motivated crimes right now. from ransomware, but I feel like it's very cyclical, and it ties itself a lot, say, the value of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, which are typically how those ransoms are paid. We've seen a shift away from, say, using an embedded Office macro to deliver, say, some nasty malware, and more to something that we call web shells, which are small little tiny files that can be installed on a server, and they're very difficult to detect. And adversaries can use those once they choose to activate them to pivot deeper into networks and launch their ransomware, their malware attacks. They can steal your information. And we think that's just because of the Microsoft move after 20 plus years to inherently disable macros inside of these documents. Now, a lot of enterprises and businesses will go, we need these enabled by default. So they reverse that decision. I highly discourage it. But again, the businesses will have to decide for themselves what's their imperative and what's their risk profile they want to adopt. Another thing that we've seen was the Clop ransomware group exploit the MoveIt FTP transfer software. It was a kind of awfulness, and one of the things that we look for in my space is ease of exploitation. So if I find something bad, how easy can I monopolize and weaponize it? And severity of, like, wow, this is really bad. This is something that gives someone complete administrative control over something. And the CVE 34362 for the MoveIt file, which is a very popular enterprise software, is very high on both of those awfulness categories that we track. We saw rapid exploitation from government to small business to anyone that was unfortunately just using that cloud-based commercial FTP software. Yeah, it was pretty rotten. You may have seen it in the news, US government institutions being targeted, like state and local. Nobody was really spared. And just as my time wraps up, I do want to convey that not-for-profits and NGOs do not get a pass from these actors, because especially if you're sort of on the larger side, those cyber insurance policies are seen as a payout cushion, so that if you are attacked by, say, something ransomware based, and they're able to steal your data and extort you back, they know you were good for some kind of revenue. For, say, my American-based companies that are 501(c)(3)s, you actually have to file tax forms, so Form 990s with the government, and those can tell a ransomware actor easily how much money you're worth and whether or not you're a suitable victim for financially based crimes. I actually recently, James, and if I ever get another one of these, I'll actually run somebody through a live exercise I did where basically I targeted a cooperative and was able to basically, well, it was bad. So, but as an expression to show how easy this actually is for these actors to identify victims and then compromise them. So really two robust avenues of risk to really address and to really think about. Unfortunately, the NGO targeting by nation state ones is going to be the perennial problem. So if you are a mobile device user, so you have Androids or iPhones, you want to treat those devices as toxic. You do not want them access to anything on your corporate or your other systems that you rely upon. So you need to understand that those devices are difficult to protect. The data on them could be compromised, and then have the realism of what do you want those devices to be used for. A mobile device management platform would be absolutely great, but they're also very expensive. So you have to kind of balance the reality of do I have the technical expertise and the infrastructure to manage those devices? And just think about how you segment, somebody whose phone may have a zero-click piece of malware on it. How do I not want them interfacing with potential, humanitarian aid victims or recipients, or people that are in vulnerable conditions? These are all really difficult questions to wrestle with. And I respect the technical challenges of making that an effective way to address risk. But that's just sort of the unfortunate way we are right now. So with that, I think my time is more or less up. We're coming to a rapid close, James. I only had about 5 minutes. But there you go. I'm the bad news deliverer.
I think it's the role many of us end up being cast in. So I'm going to maybe prevail on our later panelists to reintroduce the hope. But no, this is a fair and a good introduction. Thank you. I'm going to maybe pivot the focus to Joel. as someone in a large INGO, CRS is an $800 million a year organization, and without putting words in your mouth, but a relatively mature NGO in terms of its technology, what does this problem look like from a seat on the inside?
Yeah, my name is Joel Urbanovich. I am the director of digital workplace and also the head of cybersecurity at CRS. And I'll talk a little bit about INGO culture as the implementer on this panel. Our culture it creates a lot of barriers and complexities in the implementation of cybersecurity controls. Our culture sort of prefers the expediency of humanitarian development assistance, the unfettered access to information, and a focus on localized decision-making authority, which are all things that often run counter to the implementation of cyber controls. It's not that our organizations intentionally do things insecurely. I think everyone would agree that from like a physical security perspective, we're all very mature in the protecting of our staff, our partners, and our program participants. It's just that lower level needs and concerns have taken precedent until recently. You think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, focus on safety, security, shelter, sustenance. Our frontline staff are focused on delivering stabilizing and sometimes life-saving services to our program participants, and often these things don't come into the forefront of their mind when they're thinking about how to help the individuals that we're all looking to serve. Our geography also poses a significant barrier to the implementation of cybersecurity programming. Many of the places that we work do not have access to reliable power and internet, and that compromises greatly a lot of the advanced security controls and systems that we use to detect and respond to cyber incidents. I think about like the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which had no internet for the better part of two fiscal quarters. The ripe environment for the distribution and spreading of malware. The other major complicating factor is our focus on partnership. It's a good thing. We love to share. We work together. However, it makes it really hard to turn anything off. We may focus, a good example, focus on the use of a particular file storage and sharing platform, and a normal organization would block all others. We can't do that because we often work not as a prime, as a support with other INGO members in the NetHope community, and often with local partners who are not, and they may use something different and drive that sharing on that platform. And so it's very hard for us to shut things off. Our staff have access to everything, and we can't restrict for fear of harming our ability to serve. So those are sort of the cultural underpinnings that we are faced with at CRS, and I think maybe not being too presumptuous to say that all of the NetHope community is faced with to some degree. Our formal cybersecurity program began in 2018 after a fairly public event that occurred in Africa with a system that we had deployed, and sort of a near miss event that woke everybody up. Prior to that, and I like to think about our program as eras. I think about the dinosaurs and the Mesozoic era. And so the era of awareness, sort of pre-2017, we knew that it was important. We knew we should be doing something, but we just hadn't committed the resources directly to cybersecurity to advance that agenda. That major event happened, sort of reframed our risk tolerances and our willingness to accept those risks in our back office systems and our country programmatic systems, and thus it entered the era of monitoring. And much of our work in the past 5 years has really been on deploying and increasing the fidelity of our information gathering and awareness, as such that we know sort of what's happening across our estate and can inform and attempt to respond in ways that are supportive of and protect the agency. More recently, I think we've reached this new era of enforcement. We've done enough in the centralizing and implementation of systems that we can actually begin to enforce controls, things like conditional access policies for what types of devices can access certain parts of our cloud infrastructure, what criteria a particular device must meet in order to authenticate into our environment. We've done enough now where we can actually begin to enforce some of these policies. And to be fair, enough other major events have occurred in that intervening 5 years that the risk profile, the tolerances of the organization are now to a point where they will accept those types of controls, whereas prior to that, it would have been an uphill battle. And when I think about what we've done, what we've been able to do, we've deployed and consolidated our identity management globally with MFA. We've deployed endpoint protection and enhanced detection and response tools to our entire corporate fleet of endpoints. We've centralized management of our network and network security. We have mostly deployed an XDR platform across the entirety of our cloud footprint, and we're now moving into managed security operations and incident and event management with a managed security service provider to attempt to protect the agency. And I'll acknowledge that CRS operates from a position of real privilege. You know, we have a very robust private donor, unrestricted donor base, and so I have access to perhaps more unrestricted funding for these types of services than many of my peers. And our organizational structure provides me a lot more latitude to make unilateral decisions around how the agency is going to protect itself. But it's still not enough. We still don't have the resources we need to do everything that we know is necessary, that the CIS controls are telling us we should do, and as quickly as we want to do them. And that lack of resourcing and inability to move as quickly as we want has caught us out in a couple of occasions. Luckily, we've done enough to limit the impact of those things, but you know, it's still not enough. And so I think that's why we acknowledge that the only way to really advance the agenda, both within CRS and the sector, is to do it together. You know, we've really focused, I've personally focused, and CRS has focused greatly since 2016 on sort of the development of the Data Protection and Information Security Working Group, you know, and you know, being both contributing and selfish, you know, trying to give as much as we take from that group, collaborating on shared problems, all in an effort to advance our own and the sector's cybersecurity maturity. I think a great example of this, and I'm going to provide sort of a natural segue to Curtis here, is our focus on the use of the CIS controls to establish sector benchmarks and identify low maturity focus areas for the working group to focus on. You know, it's been a great tool for us internally to help us focus our limited resources to the things we think are the greatest risk to the agency, and allow us to collaborate across the entire NetHope community on areas of shared concern. And so, James, I'll kick it back to you to then to pass it over to Curtis.
Thanks, Joel. A wise man, I think, once said the universe runs on 3 things: energy, matter, and enlightened self-interest. And I think that consume and also contribute vision you put is absolutely bang on and reflects CRS's work in this space. Curtis, you've across your career seen and overseen a huge amount of work on many aspects of these problems, including with us on the CIS controls and together with the broader team at the Center for Internet Security on the ISAC. I wonder if you can draw some of these threads together for us and give us some perspective and maybe even some hope if you feel we deserve it.
Yeah, no, first of all, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar with my distinguished panelist and certainly you, James, as the moderator here for us. So I'm Kurt Dukes. I'm EVP and General Manager for Security Best Practices at the Center for Internet Security. Prior to that, I spent a little over 3 decades at the National Security Agency, primarily working the defensive mission, really trying to build security into U.S. government communications for that. I had the privilege of actually watching a nation state at play and trying to build, if you will, better security mousetraps, based off of that. And so what I came away from that and what I'm trying to apply here at the Center for Internet Security is really around, and it's one of the the key takeaways from the report. It's really this focus on the basics. I can't tell you how important just a focus on the basics it really is, and that's really is at the crux of what is the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls. And so, but before I get into that, I really want maybe just a little bit of background on the controls. And so, the controls were founded at the National Security Agency, and it really was started out as what was known as NSA Top 10. And basically what we were trying to do at that time was we got tired of watching, our friendly forces, what we call blue teams, actually target, U.S. government DoD systems and the ease in which they were able to compromise those systems. And so what we asked was, well, what would be the top 5 or top 10 things that you could do that actually would make a difference to actually incur a cost on the adversary? And so henceborn were the NSA Top 10. The SANS Institute got a hold of that, and of course they went from friends and family to a huge enterprise, and actually upgunned it to the SANS Top 20 from that, and then we actually created what was known at the time the CIS Top 20 critical security controls from that. But again, the focus really was on the basics, and that really was around knowing your environment, patch management, configuration management, monitoring, logging, things of that nature. And so that's really been where our crux has been. And so a few years back, we said, hey, 20 controls, while important, there really are 171 underlying safeguards or actions that we want you to take. And said, is there a way for us to actually make that better by kind of creating an on-ramp for how you would actually implement a cybersecurity program? And so we created what we call implementation groups. And we strongly believe that implementation group 1 is that foundation, is that starting point for any effective cybersecurity program. This is not to say that other frameworks aren't important. They are hugely important. It's just that we're trying to give you a set of prioritized actions to take to defend yourself. And I'll get into why I think that's hugely important. And so with version 7.1 of the controls, we created implementation groups. When it came time to actually update the controls and move to version 8, we actually looked at the threat, and we ended up reducing the number of controls. We went from 20 to 17. We added one back, which was really around services, so we're back up to 18. But we also reduced the number of actions that we want you to take from 171 to 154 actions that we want you to take for that. So why did we do that? Well, we have what we call the community defense model. So we're trying to actually back our choices with data on the attack techniques that adversaries use to attack you. And so we reviewed upwards of 35 different threat intelligence reports. We relied heavily on the Verizon data breach report, but we also looked at 34 other sources. And we said, okay, well, and then we used the MITRE ATT&CK platform, which actually talks about the attacker techniques, sub-techniques, as well as their tactics. And we said, well, just how effective are our controls? And so with our community defense model, we actually measured it. And so with the most recent version against the top 5 attack types, and they are in no particular order: ransomware, malware, web applications, insider threat, and targeted intrusions. Yes, ransomware is a form of malware, but because of how endemic it is across the globe, we felt it important to break it out. And so we kind of modeled those 5 attack types. And then we try to measure how effective not only implementation group of the controls were, but also the entirety of the 154 controls and 154 safeguards and 18 controls for that. And so as it turns out, if you implement all 154 safeguards, it's highly effective against attacker techniques. Again, this is our measure. We published this. We're open and transparent about it, but we're just trying to say, if you actually take these actions, you actually are raising the bar significantly and will incur a cost on the adversary to attack you. Now, Joe absolutely expertly pointed out 0 click and 0 days. there's no defense against that. At best you can do is minimize the ability of the attacker to move across your enterprise. But if it's a 0 day, there's really isn't much you can do about it. But as soon as 0 days is used, then defenses can rally and say, okay, here's effective measures to minimize that attack from that. And so what we've done really is, we've gone from 20 controls down to 18. We've gone from 171 to 154 actions to take. And we've measured that against how attackers and the techniques that they use to attack you with. And so that's why we believe so highly in the critical security controls. So, but really, it all rests on this focus on the basics, and that's called out for in the report. The second topic that out of the report that I wanted to speak to is really about using a framework. You really do need to choose a framework and start measuring yourself against that. We believe strongly in the critical security controls, but if you're already aligned with ISO 27002 series, or if you have a regulatory requirement to measure against PCI, then absolutely do that. So what we've tried to do from a CIS perspective is actually provide mappings. So if indeed you have a regulatory requirement to be measured against PCI, you can still use the controls, and we can show you by implementing that control and that underlying set of safeguards that you get credit for meeting the requirement for PCI for that. You may still require a separate audit as part of that, but at least what we're trying to do is at least map to these other frameworks. Yes, indeed, we are in the era of multiple frameworks. It's unfortunate, but I would tell you that if you look at all the different frameworks, there's between 80 and 85% overlap in all of them. They're actually asking for the exact same set of requirements. So choose one, but then actually implement it and start measuring yourself against it religiously as part of that. And so definitely use a framework. The third topic I really wanted to talk about was, and this is relatively new, and James spoke to it. It's the Global Humanitarian ISAC, and so NetHope is actually start looking to kind of define that concept and start building that out. And really, what this is a information sharing and analysis center, and it's a way to formalize the relationship between trusted entities. And so within NetHope and the family of NGOs, there's 65 trust entities, and they all have a shared common mission. And so by coming together and forming this ISAC, we can now start collectively sharing threat intelligence that actually is targeting this sector. And then, so if one NGO is being hit, they can quickly share, what's happening with that NGO with the other NGOs within that. So I think creating this ISAC is going to be a huge opportunity for this community to actually start defending itself. And it's really the collective of each of these NGOs, as well as NetHope and partners like Cisco and Okta and CIS and others that can actually help with that. The other opportunity with this ISAC is it creates a platform, and that platform allows for communication amongst the NGOs with other entities where you can actually share the threat intelligence, but equally importantly, you can share incident response and get support should you become a victim and be attacked. And so I'm really I'm hopeful that as this ISAC gets stood up, and again, the Center for Internet Security is a full partner in this with NetHope. We want this Global Humanitarian ISAC to be successful. We currently operate 2 of them. And so we've got a lot of lessons learned that we want to share with NetHope in this regard. But I think it will actually make a huge difference within this community. And then finally, maybe as a teaser, we are currently working on a paper, and we call this paper "The Cost of Cyber Defense," and really we're looking to release this paper in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And what we're trying to do is actually define what is the cost of cybersecurity, and again, we do align it with implementation group 1 of the CI's critical security controls, but at least that would give you a target cost. If you were to fully implement IG1, then this is what we believe it would cost you to do that. Now, we look at it from a couple of different lenses. One lens is if you're managing all the infrastructure yourself, then there would be this sort of cost associated with it. If you move to the cloud, then there would be a different set of cost involved with it. And then third, if you're actually working through a managed service provider, then there would be different cost considerations for that. And so we've tried to at least tie this to the different use cases that we see. We also have tiering of organizations. So it could be if you're a smallish organization, then you may have this type of resources currently available, and this is what what it would cost you. If you're a much more robust, much larger organization, then you already have certain resources that are organic to your organization, and so there may be different risks that you'd look at it from that alignment. So bottom line is we want to start talking about the actual cost of cyber defense. This is our first foray into it, and I look forward to releasing it and getting the earnest feedback from not only the tech sector in the community, but also from NGOs such as yourself. And so with that, James, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks, Kurt. And that was a fantastic and varied treatment, I think, of some of the problems, and particularly connecting with those 2 themes at the end. The cost piece of research I know our member base will well receive, and also your points about community, on which we agree. And I wonder, in fact, if I can come back to that cost point, because a lot of the conversations that we have are about that. And we have a question in the comments about funding from donors who've been reluctant historically to fund digital protection work. How are they changing their thinking? We're finding they are. The conversations that we're having pretty actively at the moment, although change is sometimes slow, and we know we'd like it to look a little bit different to how it looks at the moment. But I wondered, Joel, if I can come back to you and ask you a question about this, particularly connecting with your reflection about the luxury, as I think you put it, of unrestricted funding. If you have any reflections on the systems change needed, or what this looks like in less luxurious INGOs.
Yeah, I think I've responding to specific donors. I think I've started to see, certainly in FCDO, some of the FCDO grant materials that I've read, an interest in seeing more direct costing for line items around data protection in particular, and privacy, like an invitation to say, hey, we're asking you to do these things. If it's going to cost extra money, please tell us and we'll compensate you. I don't know that I've seen all that much, at least in the grant making side. Contracts a different story altogether, but on the grant making side, haven't seen all that much from the major institutional donors sort of inviting that. And I think that's what scares everybody, is that if it's viewed as overhead, then we don't compete with each other, but we do. I mean, we're all sort of after the same grant vehicles, that the introduction of significant cybersecurity cost into a proposal might look like you're less competitive or more expensive, when in reality, all you're doing is articulating the real cost of operations to do a good job, but you're being penalized for that. I think the structurally, the best approach to this is the way I think monitoring and evaluation was approached years ago, in that it was sort of assumed to be something that everyone needed to do a good job of stewarding the funds that were granted to an organization, and it was just an accepted line item that everyone was expected to put in, not something you compete on. And so something like that for cyber would be spectacular. That, hey, we assume that X percentage on top of whatever your proposal is, or X dollars per full-time equivalent necessary to implement this particular proposal, will be required to secure the program. A good example would be, Gartner annually produces metrics, key security metrics, and they're cross-sector benchmark for IT security spending per employee. Not necessarily saying that that's the right amount, but it's as good a place to start as any, is $550-ish per person per year. That's what the average spending is across all sectors on security. So why not establish something like that that says, oh, okay, you have this many FTEs on a particular program. The assumption is that we're going to give you that much money per person to secure your program. And you don't have to say it's going to cost us this much. It's just assumed. I think that's the only way we get to a place where, and maybe that's still not enough, but to a place where organizations that are predominantly, if not exclusively, funded through restricted vehicles get enough to make a dent in their controls maturity.
Thanks, Joel. It's always a joy in some of these spaces when you see the kind of convergent evolution of people coming to similar conclusions, like we need community, we need to cost this better. And I think connecting your thought and Kurt's reflections on costing cybersecurity together, that feels wise to me and certainly aligns with a lot of the conversations we're having. I wanted to come back to the point on conflict, which, while it's not a question we've been asked in the chat, I'm going to be capricious as a moderator, and we get it a lot in other spaces. Joe, I wondered if I could come back, particularly with your experience in Ukraine and elsewhere, and ask sort of very open-endedly, what is the future of cybersecurity in conflict? What should NGOs who are going to have to routinely respond in conflict zones in the future be thinking about strategically? And as the vendor in the room, not to pick on you too much, but if you have reflections on the role of the tech sector and how we work best with you, I'd love to hear those as well.
Great question. Tough question. I am actively involved in the cyber defense of Ukraine right now, and I think some of the lessons that I've been able to draw is that, to quote the philosopher / comedian Ron White, it's not that the wind is blowing, it's what the wind is blowing. And the situational awareness that you, I think this is inherent human nature. We get a myopia about responding to crises, right? We're about deploying people, getting resources to the vulnerable and the affected. But there has to be a little bit of sanity in the mid-level or the top level where we go, look, you're being deployed, you're going to have assets in field, and we know country X hates country Y and would seek to prey upon you for information, maybe from a tactical military perspective, maybe just from a humanitarian aid database exploitation perspective, and that we need to address the risk. And it's such a broad question, risk. I guess, when folks sit down and they think, wow, we don't want to get hacked, the question that I always throw at folks is, what's the worst day you could have, right? And if you can kind of start to answer that question, then you could think about, well, how do I invest what limited resources I have to keep that day from happening? With the understanding that there is no silver bullet, there is no panacea for this. But what you can do is you could start to layer your risk in solutions that give strong cost to benefit relationships, like multi-factor authentication, right? Or other solutions that help you. The mobile device management one's a great example for that, because MDM is just not a cheap date. It never will be, unfortunately. But if you're going to send someone into a conflict zone, and like Ukraine, Russia is a great example of that. The Russian government has a profound intelligence apparatus. They're incredibly good at taking over mobile devices and snooping. They have a long, proud tradition of it, and they're A game. They are strong. If I'm going to give them an Android phone or an iPhone and I'm going to send them into that area, I need to have the expectation that phone is already compromised. So how do I limit that exposure to both the victims of the humanitarian crisis and ourselves who are trying to deliver aid? And that is the open-ended question, and it's always going to revolve around, well, what can we sanely invest to prevent that? And that's going to be any armed conflict in the world where you're going to see victims pour out of countries and refugees. Governments never seem to have trouble finding money to prey upon the vulnerable folks that they don't like. Any civil war is a great example of that. So that's just kind of my spicy hot take, I suppose.
Thanks, Joe. I think those are some good reflections. I mean, putting words in your mouth and summarizing, I'm hearing sort of community-driven, context-aware response that then draws those technical pieces together, which certainly matches some of the all roads for us naturally lead to the ISAC at the moment, but the thinking we've done in it. Maybe picking one of the questions out of the comments and bridging a bit. We've got a question about security controls designed for office and business environments might not be applicable or practical for the field where humanitarian and development work happen, or perhaps in some of these conflict settings can anyone talk to the adoption of CIS controls? Any of my panelists, I wonder, Joel or Curtis in particular, if you have reflections on that one.
I don't mind starting. Yeah. So, and that's part of, what we try to do. With the controls, we're trying to at least solve the 80% problem, and really in looking at every environment. I will say that every industry vertical is attacked, and most of the attacks are the same across those verticals. Now, when it comes to in the field environments, again, I'll go back to this focus on the basics. If you're able to patch and maintain the operating system, if you're able to configure it, if you're limiting user accounts to that, I mean, that will wipe away a large number of attack vectors that you have today. It won't solve against all of them, but at least for many of them. And so, what we're trying to do is giving the different environments, is there a subset or there's, a certain set of things that you should do. And that's why we have prioritized the critical security controls. And again, first three really are around knowing the environment. And by the way, those are primarily IT functions, knowing what hardware you have, knowing what software and what's the patch status of it. And the third one, knowing your data, the sensitivity of data and where that data is maintained. That's really about knowing your environment. And then following that, it's really patching configuration in that regard. And these are all things that you can do relatively low and should be able to manage within the field. Now, I get it. If you're limited on bandwidth, then you have to figure out, when you can check in and have those devices updated to the latest patch. But outside of that, simple things can be highly effective against knocking down a large number of attacks. Maybe not as efficient against nation state, but certainly against most ransom or most cyber criminals, you can actually do an effective job.
Thanks, Kurt. That's a great answer. And a theme, I think, running through all of these of context aware, which strategically for humanitarians feels like one of the challenges ahead of us. I'm going to say thank you to all of our panelists. We're more or less at time. And also to the broader community that gave us the data to produce this research, and also the amazing team at NetHope that made it possible, in particular, Zaka Kere, who's on the call, and Diana Langley, as well as the broader extended team, without which it just wouldn't have been possible. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Seth, who I think will take us to the top of the hour and home.
All right, thanks so much, James. Appreciate it. Many thanks to our excellent and engaged audience today. Shout out and many thanks to all of our speakers again for an amazing presentation. Remember, everyone, this webinar series needs your voice. You can help us improve this vital resource for the NetHope community by filling out our satisfaction survey. Links are in the chat, and they will also be in our follow-up email and on our webinar landing page at nethope.org. And that email will be coming your way in the next few hours with links to the webinar recording, the slides, and other resources shared today, during today's presentation and discussion. So on behalf of our presenters and NetHope, we wish you a great rest of your day wherever you are in our wide world. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.